Hello and welcome to this Blackwell online podcast. My name is George Miller and my guest today is Tim Bale, who's Senior Lecturer in Politics at the University of Sussex. Tim has published a major new assessment of the Conservative Party from the fall of Thatcher to the ascent of Cameron. It's a terrifically enjoyable read for anyone who lived through the wilderness years of the Tories, full of anecdotes and colourful characters, but also never losing sight of the big questions. Why did the Tories come so grievously unstuck? And why, when their fortunes did change, did they achieve a turnaround so quickly? The book appears with impeccable timing as the general election looms on the horizon. But I began by asking, how had Tim originally conceived the project?
Well, I actually thought about writing the book before David Cameron came along. So the initial question I was interested in asking was, what had gone so wrong for this party that historically was so successful? And I guess, I had the feeling, or you don't have to be an expert to have that feeling, that eventually something must happen to change things for them. So when Cameron came along, I realised that this wasn't simply going to be a story of a party that had got stuck, but it was going to allow me to ask a second question, which was, how is it that someone could come along and actually change things very quickly, which David Cameron's managed to do?
You say in your acknowledgements that some of your friends are mystified by your love affair with the Tory party. And while I imagine you might not describe it in exactly those terms, what was it that kind of drew you towards the Tory party as an interesting subject?
Well, it's partly actually because it is, relatively speaking, neglected by academics. I mean, historians are quite keen on the Conservative Party, but political scientists, and I call myself a political scientist, tend, I guess for the most part, to be more interested in the Labour Party. And that might reflect their own political predilections. It might just reflect a tradition of writing about the left rather than the right. So in a way, what I was interested in doing was kind of redressing that balance. And also, I first trained as a historian, and I was very aware, as most people are, that the Conservative Party is probably the oldest and the most successful party in the world. And I did think there was a puzzle there. Why was it that this party got so badly stuck? Because normally, if you looked at it prior to 1997, it had always been able to, pick itself up and dust itself off and start all over again very, very quickly.
And is the Tory party a party like any other party when you get down to it, when you kind of analyse it, or is there something unique about it?
I think that's a very good question, and that's partly why I decided to write the book as well, because one of the things I wanted to do was actually have a look at what comparative political science says about political parties and why they do and don't change, and actually see whether one could apply that to a political party like the Conservatives, most of the writing on which is very, I wouldn't say parochial, but at least very British centred. It regards it as somehow sui generis, as somehow different from all other parties. And I actually don't take that point of view. I think we can apply some of the lessons we can learn from other parties to the Conservative Party, and there are a whole host of reasons why we might predict that a party would get stuck, and some of those apply to the Conservative Party.
The story you tell is not simply one of a party which didn't seem to be able to learn from its mistakes for quite a lot of time, but didn't even seem able to identify them as mistakes.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think one of the interesting things about politicians, one of the paradoxes in some ways of our perception of politicians, is that very many of us say, all these guys will do anything to get elected. But actually, these guys won't do anything to get elected. Very many of them are quite ideological, they are quite partisan, and that means that actually they wear a kind of filter or a blinker, which means that they very often, as you say, don't even see that there's a problem. Or if they do see there's a problem, they deflect the nature of that problem, so that, for example, the Conservatives, I think, spent a long time thinking there's something wrong with the salesman rather than there's something wrong with the product. And that's not to say there wasn't anything wrong with the salesman, but I think if you focus all the time on the salesman rather than the product, that means that you're not going to make the changes you need to make to actually move on.
And so the post-mortem that one might have expected to follow the 1997 landslide defeat was a very, very long time in coming, wasn't it?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think you put your finger on it there. I don't think the post-mortem really took place in earnest, to be honest. Certainly at the upper reaches of the party, when you look at the elected politicians, until 2005 and after the 2005 election. So we're really talking about 3 elections and 3 very bad defeats before the party finally came round to actually seriously thinking about what had gone wrong. And I think there was a good deal perhaps of complacency in 1997. I think a lot of Conservatives believed that they'd won the ideological battle with the Labour Party, and somehow all they had to do was to sort of sit tight and wait for the Blair project to implode, and they believed it would do so quite quickly. And then when it didn't, they were left wondering, well, what was going on. And it took them really until 2005 to realise that it was them rather than the electorate or rather than the Labour Party that was the problem.
And the long shadow of Thatcherism is one which is cast over that entire decade following the defeat, isn't it? It seems to be an idée fixe that many in the party cannot really exercise.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, while I wouldn't necessarily go along with the view that the party's problems were due to its guilt about committing some kind of matricide when it dumped Margaret Thatcher, I do think a lot of people in the party were persuaded that she somehow had a kind of winning recipe, and that they really, to get back on track, all they had to do was repeat that winning recipe, and that winning recipe was to do with a touch of populism, commitment to tax cuts, to shrinking the state, to privatisation, etc. In other words, they were looking to win their way back with a recipe that probably applied very well to the 1970s and 1980s, but didn't apply so well to the 1990s and the noughties.
And I suppose that's one of the myths that kind of nourished the party in those bad years. And there were other myths, like the myth that Labour had simply stolen their clothes, and it was simply a matter of pointing that out and reclaiming them. Yes,
I mean, it's interesting. The Conservative Party, as I said earlier, tended to see that it had won this ideological battle, and that actually blinded them to the fact probably that Labour wasn't quite the collapse to Thatcherism that some people were suggesting. And if you look at the Labour Party and Labour government policy rather than Labour government rhetoric, you could actually suggest that it's a pretty standard social democratic party. I mean, huge spending on education, huge spending on health, which doesn't indicate to me, and shouldn't really have indicated to the Conservative Party, that somehow this represented, the victory of conservatism long term over Labour. Really, what the Conservatives should have picked up was that what Blair and Brown actually at the time had managed to do was combine Labour's reputation for caring with the Conservatives' reputation, if you like, for competence, and put those two things together, and that was the electoral winning combination. It wasn't really a Thatcherism that was going to help them anymore.